It is Sunday, October the 21st, 2018. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast. I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, Frances Perkins. You remember back in the day when they used to make liberals worth a damn. We're talking about one of the liberals today. Before we get to all that, of course, as always, a brief reminder that this show is made possible by listeners like you. You can go to patreon.com/distantpeasant. You can become a recurring donor for as little as $1 a month. I don't put out a lot of premium content, but what I do put out, you can absolutely get for $1 per month, for sure. If you'd like to leave a one-time donation, there's a PayPal link at my website, distantpeasant.com, which is always headquarters. Thank you for your contributions and for listening. In Alice in Wonderland, the king says to Alice, quote, "Begin at the beginning and go on till you come to the end. Then stop." Well, with due apologies to Lewis Carroll, I'm not going to do that. On March 25th, 1911, a fire erupted in the 8th floor of a building in New York City, most likely caused by a lit cigarette or match. The 9th and 10th floors would catch soon as well in this fire, combined with locked doors for what boss types call inventory control, and shoddily constructed fire escapes would ultimately cost 146 employees of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory their lives. Most of them burned to death or died of smoke inhalation, but some leapt to their deaths from their 8th, 9th, or 10th floor windows to escape the flames. Nearly all the victims were young women, mostly immigrants, in their teens or early 20s. Outside this burning building was a sophisticated lady, 30 years old, waspy, whose daddy had read her Greek when she was 8, unmarried. She was having tea, of course. Quote, "Never shall I forget that cold sinking feeling at the pit of my stomach as I watched those girls clinging to life on the window ledges until, their clothing in flames, they leaped to their death." End quote. She would later say. Her name was Frances Perkins, future Secretary of Labor of the United States of America. It will probably always be a rare thing for me to choose an actual wielder of political power as a subject for treatment. I'm not against the having of heroes in general. Indeed, I can fairly say that everyone I've covered seriously so far I consider heroic in some way. But I am wary of the heroification of politicians in general. The world is full of histories and biographies ranging from fair to slavering on U.S. presidents, judges, senators, governors, and cabinet members. And I don't want to be that. But Frances Perkins, in many ways, defined how a modern Uncle Sam might actually practically go about protecting the working people of this country. Hell, even protecting the ones who can't work. Tough, cool, cultivating a matronly image specifically to manipulate men, and serving for 12 consecutive years as Labor Secretary, she really is an example of how even the most bourgeois among us, however white, however Anglican, however privileged, can reach further, demand better. Now, Frances Perkins was no socialist or communist, but she was a type of liberal you don't see around much these days. The liberal who could look to their left flank and not be driven to throw a punch, but instead extend a hand. Fannie Coralie Perkins was born April 10th, 1880. She would later officially join the Episcopal Church in 1905 and change her first name to Frances, which I will use from here on. Her parents were conservative, middle class. Her father would found a stationery store shortly after her birth in Worcester. Lacking a college education himself, her father was a voracious reader, interested in law and classical poetry, and they were a pious lot in their own way. Congregationalists, that way was, the descendant faith tradition of the Pilgrims, so, super fun. Her father did encourage her education at a time when it was not at all the norm for women to pursue one. And so it was that she attended Worcester Classical High School, Mount Holyoke College, and later the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia. In between stints in college, she would also teach physics and biology, as well as volunteer as a social worker at the various settlement houses set up for European immigrants. The settlement movement in this context refers to the somewhat paternalistic method for middle-class do-gooders to live among the impoverished and share with them cultural knowledge, and more importantly probably resources, education, healthcare, and daycare for working families. In America, particularly among such social workers, was an important concept floating about then, known as scientific philanthropy. Charity for the poor on behalf of the rich has existed probably as long as there have been rich and poor, I think they would fairly contend. And so the goal of charity should be the breaking of the cycle of poverty, rather than poverty's immediate alleviation. Paternalistic or not, it was certainly the sort of thing that was better done than left undone. Such was the opinion of Mary Hogan in 1901, one of the girls at a house Perkins worked in. After an accident at a candy factory in Worcester led to the chopping off of her hand, Mary's employers simply sent her home for the day. Enraged, Perkins grabbed a priest, more influential in those days than today, no doubt, and harangued the boss until he forked over $100. Not exactly fair compensation, but still worth something close to $3,000 today, according to inflation calculations, so not nothing. If Frances Perkins had peaked as a sort of well-meaning middle-class social worker, though, we wouldn't be here speaking of her memory. In 1905, she joined the Episcopal Church and changed her name, as I mentioned before. And she enrolled as a guest at the most famous settlement house in America, probably, Chicago's Hull House. This enrollment marks pretty much the last time she uses her middle initial as well, which is why I haven't been using it at all myself. It also marks the next step in the evolution of her personal philosophy. For Chicago's Hull House was pretty popular with trade union enthusiasts. Trade unions, quote, were an evil to be avoided if possible. You did good to the poor with charitable relief, friendly visiting, mothers' clubs, that sort of thing, end quote. She was once so taught. Now she met another point of view, when she took her frustrations to the son of the founder of the Chicago Commons. Mr. Taylor told her, quote, if every working man and woman would join a trade union, then the wages would be sufficient to support people, and then the families would be able to look after themselves. And there would not be this necessity for these various services that go through the charity societies, the settlements, and so forth. End quote. Perkins read, she worked, she helped groups of immigrant laborers get their pay when their employers simply withheld it because they thought they could get away with it. Whereas she did imagine that, a strong trade union would sure make her unnecessary, as with sufficient solidarity they could demand the money and redistribute it themselves, with the threat of strike to back it up. In 1907, she moved to Pennsylvania to work and study. This time, her job was to study how immigrants at port were being treated to begin with at Philadelphia, particularly, as they so often seem to end up in shitty jobs with shitty bosses and shitty homes, frankly. What she found was groups of men waiting for these people at dock, ready to direct new immigrants to what they said were boarding houses and employment offices to help them out. Before these immigrants could even begin to understand what exactly was happening to them, many times, women were shuffled off to brothels, and those employment offices were basically just sham middlemen out to take a substantial finder's fee for the oh-so-difficult service of finding them a dangerous and dirty factory job or whatever. Her report on this put a stop to most of that kind of thing at the docks for at least a time, as the city's eye was drawn that direction. And with its gaze came a few cops to hang around the docks and train stations. And most of those employment offices, quote-unquote, were put out of business. Francis Perkins also impressed her economics professor, and because of this, he was able to arrange a graduate student fellowship for her at Columbia University, where she earned master's degrees in economics and sociology in 1910. Afterwards, she of course went to live in the city. Now, just to refresh your memory, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which guaranteed the franchise to women, is still about a decade away. New York State will be a bit faster, the first eastern state to offer the franchise fully and completely to women, but this was still another 7 years away. Perkins would join with many other women of decent, solid middle class or even upper class foundation and good breeding in New York City without political power, but who were nonetheless determined to be more than just mothers and daughters, all of whom grasped towards something more in their own ways, through faith, study, achievement, activism. Perkins herself headed the National Consumers League for a while before becoming its secretary. Her efforts resulted in a state bill to limit the work week for children and women to 54 hours. A start, I guess, right? Also in 1910, she encountered her first wild Roosevelt. Franklin was then 29, tall and handsome. Still on his feet, of course. Was on his way to take his first job in politics the next year as a state senator in New York. Perkins and Franklin Delano Roosevelt would get along famously, in both senses of the word, in that they got on well nearly all of the time, and many people knew it. Quote, "I am bound to him by ties of affection, common purpose, and joint undertakings," end quote, she wrote of him. Her and Harold Ickes, the Interior Secretary, would be the only two cabinet officials to remain with Roosevelt his entire time as president. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In 1911, she witnessed the fire that occurred at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, as I described earlier. Shortly afterwards, the second wild Roosevelt in her life appeared, ex-president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, who was still popular enough nationwide that party bigwigs in Ohio in 1912, from incumbent President Taft's home state no less, would openly pine for TR to be president again. And he himself would mount a third-party run that next year, and lose to Woodrow Wilson, naturally. The old bull moose suggested Perkins would be a good choice to serve as executive secretary on the resulting commission, which she did, and which is how we know exactly how and why all those people died, and why we know they didn't have to. Perkins didn't take notes or fetch coffee either, if you were thinking that. She was a combination expert witness, investigator, and guide for the commissioners. And they did get some laws passed, which at the time were the most progressive and comprehensive in the nation. Flash forward to 2007 when Trump Tower, which recently caught on fire and killed a man, can successfully lobby the city of New York for an exemption on sprinkler installation. In 1913, she married Paul C. Wilson, an economist and progressive Republican type. They had one daughter, Susanna, in 1916. Paul would tragically suffer a mental breakdown a few years after the birth of his child. He probably had severe and debilitating bipolar disorder, though in the 19-teens they had no real idea or definite words to describe what was wrong with him. Wilson would be in and out of mental institutions for the rest of his life. So Perkins, who was going to keep her surname Healthy Husband or No, by the way, as well as the Miss and not the Mrs. in the front, would be the sole breadwinner for her and her daughter. Unfortunately, this meant hiring people to take care of her child a lot after she was no longer an infant, which contributed to an unhappy childhood for Susanna and much strain on their bond. In any case, Paul was fine with all of this, and they felt strongly enough about it that the couple hired a lawyer when a life insurance company refused to issue policies in her name for them. I have read that occasionally, as a matter of convenience, she would use the name Mrs. Paul C. Wilson, such as for passports and hotels, and that her mother always introduced her as Mrs. Wilson, but she had developed a rep as Frances Perkins. And be damned if she was going to throw that away just because she was getting married. The somewhat famous Governor Al Smith appointed her to the State Industrial Commission when he became governor for the first time in 1919, following her vigorous campaigning for him as a wet progressive, that is, anti-alcohol prohibition. When he lost the governorship in 1921, Perkins resigned as well and went back to social work. But when he returned in 1923, so did Perkins, this time to the Industrial Board, as it was then called. By 1926, she was running the whole thing, and was particularly renowned for her workers' compensation advocacy. In a day when the workplace was not just dull and unremunerative, but dangerous to the point of deadly sometimes. And it was common for laborers in such places to simply be sent home and replaced, or perhaps bought off with a pittance when injured. As an aside, Al Smith is not much remembered as a figure of national significance. He who would lose the 1928 presidential election to Hoover and fail to secure the Democratic nomination in 1932 against FDR. But he really should be, at least a little bit. In his elections, it is nearly always mentioned that he employed a largely urban machine to turn out massive numbers of votes for himself, not all of which were cast legally, of course, and this is true. But what's also true about his elections is that you can see through them the changing prism of America at the time, which was rapidly urbanizing. The Jeffersonian and Jacksonian vision of America as a largely agricultural society of yeoman farmers and slave-owning barons had greatly informed the system of government and representation they designed, such as it was anyway, that existed in the early 20th century. But grafted beneath the whole thing now were huge concentrations of population in urban areas. Smith represented a nascent progressivism that insisted the government, whatever its graft, should be more responsive to the needs of everyday citizens, most of whom were more and more to be found in metropolitan areas. He also represented the country's changing religious content in his own way. The temperance movement, of course, was a largely Protestant affair, and many of these new urban citizens were immigrants of Catholic or Jewish stock, Italians, Polish, Swedish, or Norwegian, often immigrating, at least in part, to escape religious persecution. In the case of Sweden at the time, for example, the state church was Lutheran, and immigrants to the U.S. from Sweden during the time mostly Catholic. Al Smith was a pious man in his Catholicism, and his opponents openly accused him of being a papist and un-American, decades before they did the same to Kennedy. The lack of memory of him probably has something to do with the fact that he would come to hate Roosevelt and the New Deal later in life. But for the time, Smith asked Roosevelt to run for governor of New York as his successor while he continued his quest to be president, of course. And so it was that FDR, post-illness and paralysis, found himself governor of New York, and how Frances Perkins found herself the New York Industrial Commissioner in 1928. At the time, this was the top executive administrator at the State Department of Labor. save the governor himself, and she became the most famous labor official in all the nation. Progressive officials in California, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Illinois, Wisconsin, and others would all find themselves following the precedents she set. Under her leadership, child labor was banned altogether under the age of 16, and the work week further limited to 48 hours for all workers. She did a ton of factory visits and also did everything she could to facilitate laws for a higher minimum wage and unemployment insurance. Now, of course, in 1929, hopefully we all know what happened. The market crashed severely that October and almost completely worldwide. What we now call the Great Depression set in, which of course was a global affair, an American affair, and a New York affair. Perkins in New York watched as Hoover's administration assured everyone loudly and publicly and repeatedly that employment figures were on the rise in January of 1930 and that recovery was well within sight. Facts she had personal knowledge of and she knew were dead fucking wrong. She called a press conference and decried Hoover's heartless deception, as she called it, and showed that figures from her own office, which was located in the largest state in the Union by population, by the way, showed that employment was way down. In fact, it was the worst it had ever been in at least 16 years. She made the papers across the country for this, and doubtlessly made the shrewd and feline Roosevelt smirk. It is at this point she evolves a little bit more, I think, and becomes committed to a pretty basic idea, but one which we have yet to embrace as a country, true and old as it is. If we must exist in a world where you must work to live, then we live in a world where to lose your job and not be able to obtain another one, either because there aren't enough or because of personal circumstance, is to carry a death sentence. Now, we ensure things of value. Let us ensure employment for everyone through a public system. Now, look, I'm basically of a mind that we don't need to live in a world where we all must work to live. I think fundamentally this orientation is the root problem with capitalism in a way, and that a system that ensures every human being's basic needs and some of the more reasonable wants too doesn't actually require the labor of all of us, not even most of us. That all being said, this was a radical step forward in thinking at the time, this idea that the market shouldn't be left to sort such things out. Not when they are a matter of life and death. It's too important. And we can't live in a world where the whims of employers can literally kill people. And so it was that FDR, as governor, became the first office-holding politician in the country to commit themselves to a program of unemployment insurance. A program that is becoming less and less a thing these days, when laws often let an employer simply stop scheduling workers, or are allowed to not let them hit full-time, or are subcontracted, or perhaps they just challenge unemployment claims and dare the broke and desperate to find a lawyer to fight them. All this is just to say, though unemployment insurance isn't the end goal of my preferred socialist society, and neither is social insurance in general, we have fallen pretty far from Frances Perkins's vision. Anyway, in November of 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with 57% of the popular vote to Hoover's 40, and around 89% of the electoral votes, became President of the United States. Now, in those days, the period of time from elections in November to Inauguration Day was longer. It wasn't until March 4th when FDR actually became president. So that February, he asked Perkins to come with him to Washington. She almost didn't, though she relished the chance to take her ideas, and she had many, for sure, by the way, to a position of national power. She really hated the spotlight. She particularly hated the idea of becoming newspaper fodder, and especially worried that her husband and daughter might get dragged into such a mess if she wasn't careful. Additionally, she was loath to move too far away from that husband, committed to a sanitarium though he might be. And in a move that I think was actually pretty cool for a liberal, she initially wrote back to Roosevelt that she should name an actual union official to the job of labor secretary, which I don't think was a bad idea at all. But FDR wanted Perkins bad, and so it was that she was summoned to his home for a meeting where he asked her to her face to be his labor secretary. She responded by telling him what she wanted on a national level: an end to child labor, a minimum wage, a 40-hour work week, unemployment insurance, old age insurance, and universal health insurance. This was cutting edge in 30s America's elite circles, at least. And it's to our great shame that not only is her agenda incomplete, coming up on almost a century later, but what was achieved probably peaked way back in the 60s or 70s. Still, for 1932, it was ambitious, and FDR asked if she thought all that was possible. She said she didn't know, but that was her program, and so if he wanted her as labor secretary, he needed to get on board. FDR got on board. In terms of domestic policy, she was FDR's right hand for years as president, and she was at the forefront of the administration's every effort to combat the Great Depression and completely redefine the relationship citizens had with Uncle Sam. The old deal had been your allegiance and your taxes, in exchange for being left alone for the most part. At least that was the pitch if you were a white male who could vote by and large. FDR had a different way, a new deal. And next week we will explore how Frances Perkins became the New Deal's mother to Father FDR, and will, among other things, help to create one of the most durable and successful social programs the United States has ever known, in the muse of one Samuel Lincoln Cedar: Social Security.